central idea is there's been this misinformation about what a no-deal Brexit would really mean, kind of peddled by hardline leavers of the Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson variety. And there's been a huge amount of pushback against that from mainstream economists, arguing that, in fact, a no-deal Brexit would have very serious consequences indeed. Now, I kind of wanted to take it to the next stage and speak to the WTO itself. The WTO is basically this organisation that, in the view of some leavers, would kind of leap to our rescue in the event of no deal. Correct. And basically everything would be fine. Well,
it's even a hashtag, Alex. It's even a hashtag now, so confident are people in the general population that it's something desirable and to our benefit.
Well, I mean, that shows on Twitter especially, people get into these silos, and I think there is a community out there that thinks that a no-deal Brexit would be basically a walk in the park. Yeah. So I spoke to figures actually at the WTO to see what they thought. Pascal Lamy was Director General for several years. Roberto Azevêdo is Director General now. And actually what they told me, and these are the figures representing the very institution that we'd be falling back on, said that actually it would be really problematic going from the situation that we have now to WTO terms. And we should think very carefully indeed before we do that. And people like Boris Johnson, who argue that we can basically have our cake and eat it, even after no deal, it will all be fine. They basically flat contradicted him. So I think this is noteworthy that people from the institution itself have weighed into the debate.
In the simplest of terms, what will happen, according to their understanding, in the event of us leaving without any deal in place? I'll put in one precursor to that. Gatt 24, as people like me have tired of explaining, Gatt 24 only kicks in when a trade agreement is more or less agreed, and it's the interim period before the trade agreement can be properly implemented. And we can't have a trade agreement until we've passed the withdrawal agreement, and we haven't passed the withdrawal agreement. So I appreciate some people still can't accept this simple truth. But leaving that aside, if come October the 31st we crash out without any deal in place, what does WTO terms mean?
I think the best way to understand it is that on economics, there's going to be trade barriers erected overnight. Huge increases in tariffs. Also, things that people call non-tariff barriers, which are things like sanitary checks and regulations. Basically, increased costs to trade that could render some businesses literally unviable overnight, and even some sectors. If you want to kind of be extreme about it, even sectors in agriculture and so on could really struggle simply to survive under those circumstances.
Simply put, so you'd be looking at 10% on cars that were being exported to or imported to the continent, and 35% on dairy products, up to 35% on dairy products. We heard Jeremy Hunt talking last week about a company in Kidderminster that had a 4% margin that would rise to 10%. He was actually right in economic terms, but he, of course, said that he would have to stand by while 260 people lost their jobs, although he did tell us he'd have a heavy heart. So these are the same numbers, aren't they? This is what we're talking about.
Yes, these are very big numbers. And the problem is that we simply can't lower tariffs just because we decide to do so after no deal, because the World Trade Organization stops you doing that, because that would count as kind of granting unfair, privileged access to markets without going through the proper channels. So Brexiteers who argue that we could leave under no deal and simply refuse to put up these trade barriers, frankly, don't know what they're talking about.
Quelle surprise. To quote the Director General, Azevêdo, Article 24 of the Gatt is simply the provision of global trade law under which free trade agreements and customs unions are concluded. If there is no agreement, then Article 24 would not apply, and the standard WTO terms would. Alex, are there any grounds for thinking that the Director General of the World Trade Organization may have a poorer grasp of World Trade Organization terms than, say, Mark Francois or Nadine Dorries?
That strikes me as very unlikely, to put it mildly.
You should be a diplomat. We might be looking for a new ambassador to America. And continuing with a slightly unprofessional line of questioning, you're much younger than me. I know this because my producer commented on the fact that you're the same age when she was looking you up earlier, which means you've been doing journalism for a lot less long than I have. I'm staggered that this isn't the biggest story in town today. I'm genuinely gobsmacked that you're the first British journalist really to dig down into this. I interviewed Lammy before the referendum, and the line that he's repeated to you about moving from the first division to the third division for no apparent reason still resonates. But just on a personal rather than a professional, or both actually, can you quite believe the scale of what the WTO top brass has told you gets 3% of the amplification and coverage than the arrant nonsense being spoken about the WTO by people like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg and others? Does that comparison stagger you, or have you managed to get your head around it?
Basically, I think it's a shame, and always, I of course would like things that we write to get as much coverage as possible. I think we are at a kind of bleak stage where misinformation reigns, and trying to cut through the fog with interventions from people in the know is increasingly difficult. And I'm not sure who specifically is to blame.
No, nor am I.
It does seem that we've kind of got to a position where we're actually in quite a dangerous place, and I'm not sure what to do about it. But hopefully, chipping away
keep
at
chipping.
it, bit by bit.
Keep chipping, and
the way.
Let me know if you ever need to borrow my loudhailer. I'll just finish with another quote from the chairman, a former chairman of the WTO's General Council. Again, there's no reason to suspect that he would understand the workings of the WTO's General Council better than Brexit hardman Steve Baker or Mark Francois. But he has said, and you've got him on the record, the effect of increased costs would be to make UK businesses less competitive, with the risk that EU importers of goods and services might look elsewhere. Potential investors would also have to take these increased costs into account when deciding where to locate investments. That's probably the most mild of quotes in your entire article, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that shows just how much these people were willing to speak out, and I think they're actually getting quite frightened now, as the 31st of October deadline.
This isn't the EU getting frightened about the no deal. This is the WTO getting frightened about the no deal that no deal advocates tell us the WTO will save us from the worst impacts of.
Right, and I think as deadline fast approaches and we kind of hurtle closer and closer towards the cliff edge, we are alarming sensible previous allies around the world who are kind of looking on in disbelief.
They can't believe it. Did you get any sense from them, final question, of surprise that, I mean, I don't know how many strings you had to pull or how many calls you had to make to get this access, but were you surprised? Did you sense from them any surprise that they're not being asked about this and not being invited to reveal this information more by the British media?
Actually, there was one thing that speaks directly to that, which is I spoke to some people who, I'm thinking of using their quotes for kind of a follow-up article or something, who didn't quite make it into this one. And one of those was Roderick Abbott, who was Deputy Director General at the WTO. And he said he couldn't believe just how dire the level of debate was, basically. He found it, frankly, astounding, given Britain's position and what we're contemplating, that people don't know about what the WTO is, how it works, even where it is and who works there. The fact that we're thinking of crashing out of Europe and falling back on this institution, it astounded him, basically, that we aren't all scrambling to become experts in it.